Thank you ever so much for the introduction, and it's brilliant to be here. Thank you. It's such an interesting couple of days, and I thoroughly enjoyed our first two talks. Thank you. I think they fit quite nicely, perhaps, with what I want to talk about. And I guess I really want to kind of move down a little bit in the length scales. And as we just heard, I'm an engineer by training. I trained as a mechanical engineer, and my interests are really in tissue mechanics and structure and function, and trying to look a little bit about nanoscale, microscale mechanics to ask questions about how a tendon works. So yeah, I guess really these are the sorts of questions that we ask in my group. How does a tendon work? And what I mean by that is, how is it that the structure of the tendon is put together to allow that tendon to stretch effectively and to recoil effectively to allow locomotion efficiency or writing or whatever it may be, depending on which tendon you're talking about. And I really kind of wanted to start by asking this with healthy tendons and saying, how does this work in a tendon when it's healthy? And then can we start to try and get to grips with what goes wrong with injury and why perhaps that happens, as an insight into some of those mechanisms. As I find tissue structure and function fascinating, I teach a course on this with our undergraduates and kind of put this up and just get them to think about it for a minute or two. There's not really very many basic constituent units, and so really we've been hearing from Michael earlier. Our matrix, we've got fibrous components, we've got collagens, we've got different elastins. They're there to provide different degrees of mechanical strength. We've got what I'm going to call non-fibrous matrix for now, to be reasonably inclusive. All those different glycoproteins and protoglycans, they're there, they keep hydration in tissues, they bind things together, they're good in compression. And that's basically all you get in all of these different types of tissues. And by putting them together in different amounts and different organisations and different ways, you can create tissues so different to something like cartilage, which is amazing in compression, to an incredibly fatigue-resistant artery, to our tendons and ligaments, which we all know and love here. Very, very different structures from the same basic building blocks. And I find that really fascinating. How is it you take them and you build a structure to meet a different functional need? And they really do meet those functional needs surprisingly well. So yeah, in terms of mechanobiology then, that for me is this concept of looking at matrix structure and organisation, firstly understanding how it provides mechanical function, but certainly as Michael was talking about earlier, there's another side to this as well, very much about the mechanobiology in the cells and how those layers interact. And we know that we've got the cells within the structure, we know our cells respond to mechanical loading. We often think, and often a lot of cell studies will say, well, a whole tendon experiences 5% strain, so we'll pop that on the cells and we'll see how they respond. But actually you've got this incredibly complex structure, which means that what a cell sees situated in a piece of tissue is nothing like what you're applying at a gross tissue level. And if you really want to engage in mechanobiology, you need to get into that and say, how does that structure work? What's happening at a cell level? To try and understand and unpick those relationships. Try to look at how that modulates matrix metabolism, of course, turns over the tissue. I'm not going to talk a lot about that area particularly today. That's sort of another side of work if anyone's interested, but I guess really I want to talk a bit about this matrix structure and mechanical function primarily today. So we might then say, okay, so what are the relationships in homeostasis in a system? How does a tendon work when it's homeostatic, it's working effectively? What happens when you get injured? If you were to try and understand what drives some of the changes in the structure of a tendon with injury. And I think ageing, and I think that hopefully will fit nicely with what Ty talks about a bit as well, ageing is quite an interesting model to investigate and look at this a little bit, because we know our injury risk increases with ageing. Can we understand a little bit about what maybe structurally changes to give us some insights there into what might be happening? And some of the different structural changes we might see, we've mentioned ages already, of course the cells change as well. It's always a multi-complex environment to try and understand. But we've got those changes, that maybe we've got problems with organs, with the tissue being unable to meet its mechanical need. I'm not sure why, but it might be that we're seeing fatigue damage accumulation. I want to have a little bit of a look at that. Also, there might be issues with cell strains also. Okay. I love this picture, I've always got to put it up, we all know it, but we love it all. Here it is, our hierarchical structure and tendon. For me, of course, it's really important because I said I'm really looking through this hierarchy. Can I get this? There we go. Down down through this hierarchy, nano to micro scale. And for me, as an engineer and materials scientist, I look at this and I think it's a fibre composite. The collagens are fibres surrounded by other matrix. It's at multiple different levels. It's a multi-level fibre composite material. So we can ask how that structure actually stretches, how it allows physiological loading, and where does damage initiate and propagate within that structure. So what I've kind of been doing is effectively trying to develop equipment, mechanical testing rigs, different mechanisms in which I can take a piece of tissue in vitro, so that's probably where I'm going to differ significantly from a lot of what's talked about here, but take that piece of tissue, be able to load it in some way in vitro, and then put it into some sort of mechanism of visualising the tissue response. So design experiments to be able to visualise what's happening when you take an explant and you load it. And there's lots of things you can do. So here's sort of what you do at nanoscale. You use, say, synchrotron rig. And here's a little rig. Here's my rig where I can load a tissue explant within the synchrotron rig. If you hit your sample with an X-ray beam, you get these beautiful little patterns like this. What these little distances between the little bars here mean is something about how fibrils are elongating and reordering within the tissue, and how spread this is tells you how well ordered the fibrils are. So you can put your piece of tissue in, you can stretch it, and you can start to see how the fibrils within the tissue are responding to that strain. It gives you an insight into the nanoscale response within that piece of tissue under load. If you go up a level, this is kind of the fibre level here. This is quite interesting to me because I said I'm very interested in the cells and the cell response. This is where you see them. Here are the cells situated along fibres. You can put the sample here in a slightly bigger rig to sit on a confocal microscope, for example. You can stain the cells, you can stain the matrix, you can stain different components so you can view them. You can stretch your tissue in the same way and look and characterise that response at this kind of fibre level. And then, of course, going up the scale again, if you want to start to look at fascicles or whole tendon, you're looking at things like videos, classic DIC pattern, where you can take bits of tissue, load them in a standard mechanical testing machine and look at the response more locally in terms of that strain. And over a number of years in a series of studies, we've been trying to kind of elucidate simply what happens when you take a piece of tissue and you stretch it. And effectively, we found that you do get a little bit of extension of individual collagen molecules at a small level, but really what you tend to see is this shearing and this sliding behaviour occurring all the way through that hierarchy, allowing the tendon to extend. Fibre composite mechanics, the fibres are stiff, that matrix between them allows them to shear and slide to stretch the tissue. And that's kind of interesting because if we think about this concept here that we were talking about, the cells and this relationship between maintaining homeostasis, of course it means that the strains within the tendon, in the collagen within the tendon, are vastly lower than actually the strain you might apply at a global level to the tendon because everything's shearing. So your cell strains are going to be rather more shear and tension, so the kind of biology studies might want to think about slightly more complex loading environments. But really, the thing that I've been picking up and looking at a bit is it seems to suggest that it's that non-fibrous matrix perhaps that's actually very important for tendon mechanics. The collagen might stretch a bit, but what's modulating and allowing this shearing behaviour through the structure? So we've been looking at that a bit. Now, here's your rat. So we were talking about this difference between rat models, and you're saying I've done quite a lot of work on equine model. I have more recently. This early work was actually started in the rat model. It's a brilliantly easy model to start doing in vitro work. You can take out fascicles and you can look at them very easily. But I did start to wonder a bit if actually things are the same in all tendons. It really is quite a simple model, and I've never seen rat tails particularly heavily loaded, I have to say. And a quick look at the literature says, yeah, we might have a problem here if we only look at rat tails. Just a pull of a bit of data, so mechanical properties, composition of tendon. Some of these are matched studies, so these are not actual differences in terms of the way the tissue is tended, mechanically tested. They're very, very different samples. It starts indicating that not all tendons are the same, and as we were hearing earlier, and yes, that seems to be the case, we can actually start to describe tendons in different ways, and this concept of energy storing in positional tendons has been something that I've been very interested in. Now, here we go, our Achilles, a nice example of an energy storing tendon. You've got something that's strained quite highly. When it's used, it must recoil very effectively so it can return energy into the system and allow us to run more quickly. Here's the equine model. Particularly interested in the horse because it it can gallop an awful lot faster than we can run, and those tendons see some very impressive strains and have some amazing energy storing capacities. So if you want a model to try and understand energy storing and different types of tendon, this one seems a great one to get into and start to investigate those relationships. So we've been working with the horse model for that reason, looking at this energy storing SDFT to understand a little bit more about how it can manage high strains and really elastic recoil. You can compare it then with a positional tendon. So you might something like tibialis anterior, something like the ones in your hand, I don't know what you want. Or here, the CET, it's an extensor tendon down the front of the horse leg, so you can match samples and look at the differences in how these two tissues respond. So we've been looking at how the matrix may be optimised to allow these differences in function. And here's just simple stress strain curves for the two tissues to get us started. Here's the energy store, here's the positional match data, exactly the same testing protocol. You consistently tend to see this behaviour where energy storing tendons are less stiff, they stretch further. It allows them to store energy more effectively, to work more effectively as a spring. So we see this more in fatigue resistant, less viscoelastic behaviour in an energy storing tendon, something that's a bit more viscous, less fatigue resistant over here in a positional tendon. So these are some of the different samples we have been looking at and trying to investigate this response a bit to understand these relationships in more detail. So I showed you those different methods, so I'm going to talk about some on the confocal microscope to start with, ways of investigating mechanics within the tissue. This is a study we did where we took tendon fascicles from our energy store and positional, equine tendon, stained all the collagen and then just bleached a grid on it. So you can stretch the tendon under the microscope and see how it deforms. Quick look at the pictures and I got quite excited. They look different before we started. So I said, well, how can we quantify it a bit? There's a number of different measures you can look. You can look at the strains here, the transverse strains, the amounts of fibre sliding, which you can kind of see here, how much the whole thing rotates, which you can see here. Lots of interesting data in here, and I haven't got time to talk about it all, but two things that particularly we found interesting were here. You'll see a few of these graphs. This is when we apply the strain to the sample. This is the parameter that we're talking about, how much of it occurs. So under applied strain, if we look at this amount of fibre sliding, here's our positional tendon. Rather more, significantly more fibre sliding than we saw here in the energy store. If we looked over here at the amount of rotation in that fascicle, here's our energy store, it seems to rotate instead of seeing sliding between fibres. There we go. And of course it's all well and good pulling things, but it's no good if you let the load off and it's actually a failure mechanism. You need to check this is an actual recoverable true mechanism. So you take the load off and see how they respond. Actually they recover pretty well, particularly the energy storing tendon. It recovers quite well from any sliding, any rotation that we see. So if we look at that, we seem to see that positional tendons were dominated rather more by sliding between fibres, whereas in the energy storing tendons we saw more fascicle rotation, and that seemed to dominate the response. And that seemed to lead to much better recovery, more elastic behaviour in the energy storing tendon. Rather like your lovely rope, thank you very much. That was a super example for thinking about that concept of energy storing and how if you're designed in this helical rope-like fashion, you're much more efficient at being able to store energy. So we seem to think that fascicles in an energy storing tendon have this helical component which allows for efficient extension and recoil. You've seen it at fibril levels, this is at a fascicle level, but it's specific to the SDFT. And there we've just started to take some EMs and have a look and start to see that twist in the fascicles, which is rather nice. So that's looking at differences really at this level here of the hierarchy between the different types of tendon. But how about some of the other structural levels? We actually moved up this way, and we did it mainly because of this particular graph that we collected during the study. And again, there's quite a few interesting things about this graph, but we're going to concentrate on one. We did some tests where we pulled a whole tendon and then isolated a fascicle, just straight a single fascicle with each tendon type to failure. And up here, this is our whole positional tendon. Down here, this is a single fascicle for a positional tendon pulled to failure. This one, whole tendon on the energy store, this one, a fascicle. And if we look at the failure strain in the positional tendon and its fascicle, they're pretty close, that's fine, seem to be reasonable. That was a massive difference in the failure strain between the whole energy storing tendon and just one fascicle from the tendon. And what really freaked me out about this is that if you look at the equine model, when that horse is galloping, it loads its tendon to sort of roughly here, during gallop. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's actually beyond the failure force of the fascicles within the tissue. How's it doing it? What's happening? It was rather interested in this higher structural level. And of course, really, you then say, well, what is this matrix between the fascicles? Something must be happening there to allow this to occur. And here's a picture of what you can see. So here's the fascicles, it's schematic, here it's in a histology. Here is the interfascicular matrix between the fascicles. See a picture of histologies, you can see the more cells, you can see them here as well. Far more cellular region in the tissue. What is it? What might be happening to allow that additional extension to occur? So we said, well, we can do some mechanics on that. Let's develop some experiments to actually characterise the mechanical behaviour of that interfascicular matrix. So you can take a shear model. Here we go. Take two fascicles. If you cut the opposing ends of the two, you can just get a nice little bit of interfascicular matrix in the middle here. And you can pull that to failure and have a look at the mechanical properties of it. We kind of expected it wasn't going to do a lot, to be honest. There's not very much material here. There's 10 millimetres of the sample. Impressive forces, actually. Up to nearly 1.5 newtons. If a fascicle only fails at 2 and a bit, this is quite good. Okay. First glance, however, I was like, oh, both tendon types are the same though. Same failure force. But of course, you're not going to load it to failure, are you, in the body? You're going to be using it somewhere around here. Actually, quite a different response in that region, and that bit became rather interesting. Here is our energy store. Look at this lower stiffness region. Remember in the energy storing tendon we needed the fascicles to slide more to allow the tendon to stretch more? Rather nicely, we see this nice low stiffness behaviour that would allow that sliding to occur more easily. And you can, that's an example curve. Here's the data over all of them. You need to find different ways to present it. This is showing how much extension you get here at different percentages of the failure load. So we keep seeing more extension all the way through in the energy storing tendon, almost up to failure. Easier to allow those fascicles to slide. And again, that's all well and good, but you could say to me, well, you're just putting the part and it's a failure mechanism. So, well, let's see what happens if we actually cyclically load it. I got incredibly excited by this data set. You really can cyclically load these samples very efficiently, effectively. Here's a few cycles on the energy store, on the positional tendon. We can look at hysteresis, stress relaxation. It's a reasonably high level of hysteresis, but it's not actually that much more than for a fascicle. It's 30% when we do this in a fascicle. This material is amazingly good at being able to cope, and we see much more elastic behaviour, less hysteresis, more ability to cope with cyclic loading again in the energy storing tendon, its IFM. So it seems that we can kind of piece this together and start to get a series of hierarchical differences between an energy store and a positional tendon about what it may be that allows an energy storing tendon to work more effectively. More sort of springy, elastic, helically organised fascicles in an energy storing tendon. They seem to extend and recover using that helix, pulls and recovers. And then they all slide relative to one another as well to allow those extra large strains with matrix between them that seems to allow more elastic sliding and recoil to occur. There we go. You can show that here sort of schematically, looking at these differences in behaviour for the different types of tendon. So that's a little bit to start thinking about what differences there may be between the different tissue types. And of course that gives a hypothesis that effectively you could consider that if you don't have some of these functional specialisms in an energy storing tendon, perhaps you've got a tendon that's a little bit more at risk of injury because it's not so capable of coping with the helical twisting and the sliding of fascicles. Could we have a look to see if we use ageing as a model? How do some of these things change with ageing? Can we understand if that has any influence on potentially the mechanics of the tissue and try to relate that to injury risk? And we said earlier we know that we've seen sort of structural changes and things, and the two areas of this that I really wanted to concentrate on is looking here at sort of fatigue damage accumulation with age and how the mechanics of the tissue might change. So, back to our confocal images, putting grids on samples. This time, this is old for a horse, it's okay. They're looking at fascicle mechanics in a young and an old group, and looking at the differences in response. Positional tendons, nothing changed, pretty boring in terms of the local mechanics within the tissue. But when we started to look at the energy stores, remember these graphs we said applied strain against whatever we're interested in. Here was that rotation we saw in our young samples. Significant reduction in that with age, in the old energy storing tendons. Here, if we look at recovery, significant reduction in recovery in the energy storing tendons with age. Yeah, hysteresis loss, of course, therefore increases as well. If we look at the IFM mechanics, that second type of data I was showing you when we were taking the two fascicles and pulling them apart and looking at the model of the IFM response, IFM stiffness increased with age. So here was our young samples. Remember we saw this lovely difference down here in the stiffness between them. These are our old tendons. That stiffness is lost. So we've lost that nice low stiffness ability for sliding between fascicles. And here you can see all the data plotted. A nice regression line here with age, looking at that change in the response of the tissue. So it seems actually that if we piece that together as well, we only saw mechanical changes with age in energy storing tendons, not positional tendons, but we saw the tightness of the helix starting to reduce, the recoverability of the helix started to reduce, and the capacity for fascicle sliding also started to reduce with ageing. All of those specialisms we found in the energy storing tendon, all starting to taper off. So, as I said, how does this affect fatigue resistance? This is really where we want to go next and start to look at fatigue properties in the tissue. So let's go back around to do the same thing again. We can take our fascicles. This time, we're still going to have a young group, we're going to have an old group, but we're going to have another couple of groups because we're going to leave half of them just as they are, subject the other half to fatigue loading first so we can look at the effects of the fatigue loading in both the young and the old samples. Same parameters, we'll look at that fibre sliding and the rotation as the ones that have perhaps been a bit more interesting. This one always keeps me a bit entertained. 4 of the graphs to think about now. So, applied strain against whatever it may be, we've got rotation at the top here. This was our young group that we were looking at. We saw that those young energy storing tendons, all of this data is just the energy store, that's where anything interesting happens. Our young energy storing tendon, we saw that rotation occurring. We saw that in the old tendon, there wasn't really any rotation occurring anymore. If we fatigue load, here's our fatigue load group. For rotation, that ability for the fascicle to rotate has gone. Of course, down here, well, you didn't have it before you started, so still, you've got no rotation. But if you mix that with these data down here, the sliding is rather interesting. So here's our sliding data. I'm going to start over here to begin with, because remember when we looked, actually no, I'm not, I'm going to start over here. Remember when we looked at the fibre sliding in the young horses, we saw that there was very little, it's quite a small axis here between the two. Very little fibre sliding really occurring in young horses. If we fatigue loaded them, nothing really changed, still very little fibre sliding. Here's our old samples. Very little fibre sliding. These axes have changed, so that's not actually really all that different to these data here. But when you're an old sample and you fatigue loaded it, so you'd already lost this ability for rotation, we saw a massive increase in the amount of fibre sliding occurring in these particular samples. Starting to suggest that actually, if you've lost that helix and you've lost that ability to cope with the cyclic loading, you start to resort to things that are rather more detrimental potentially to tendon health. How about looking at ageing in the IFM and fatigue resistance then? So we can cycle these things to failure as well. Here's the different cycles to failure in the energy store and the positional tendon, loads more cycles to failure, typically in the IFM in an energy storing tendon. We're starting to look at the effects with ageing at the moment. We've got half the data, they take forever, these experiments, but we're getting together, but preliminary data is starting to suggest you're losing that elasticity in the IFM with age. So you're losing that mechanism as well. So everything's starting to reduce. So kind of building a possible hypothesis about what might be happening. So we can look here at our nice young energy storing tendon doing what it should be doing, using this spring to stretch and recoil nice and effectively, using that IFM to allow the fascicles to slide and to recover nice and effectively. Unfortunately, when you're old, both of these mechanisms are a bit limited, which might make life a bit difficult for you. And if you fatigue load, it seems to suggest that's exactly what happens. You fatigue load a young sample, it kind of seems to cope. It can use the mechanisms, they start to deteriorate, but it can use them and it can cope with that loading. Once you've got an old sample, there seems to be no real mechanisms to resist loading and it resorts to fibre sliding. And I hypothesise that potentially you're starting to see some very localised degrees of damage, localised changes to the cell environment, which is where you might start to see damage in the tissue. Of course, it's not all just about age. Remember, if you started to really overload even a young sample, you started to lose that coil, you started to lose the mechanisms, which of course just takes you up to here. So again, you're on a path that you continually overuse that tendon, but potentially you're working your way down to seeing this localised damage. Okay. So potentially the IFM, poorly optimised IFM, maybe does it lead to injury? Right, I need to be very quick now. I've got a couple of slides just to show you. It would be a little bit unfair to have talked about it mechanically and not really say anything about what the IFM might be. So at the moment, one of the things we're looking at is what is it? What's in it? And is it different in energy storing tendons? And these are a series of pictures in a recent paper we just published. Energy store, positional, lovely elastin stain. Perhaps not surprising, that seems to be where the elastin is, predominantly in tendons. Loads of elastin in the intervesicular matrix in energy storing tendons. Lubicin, that was kind of nice as well. Lubricator, which you see in cartilage. Lots of lubicin in the intervesicular matrix in the energy storing tendon. Things that will allow those sorts of behaviours we see. Decorum is a bit more interesting. The primary proteoglycan we see in tendon is actually quite fascinating. Here it is, localised predominantly to the intervesicular matrix in the energy storing tendon. But in the positional, actually, there seems to be a lot of it down between the fibrils and the fibres. But remember, that tendon type used fibril fibre sliding. So actually, maybe it's where it needs to be in the different tendon types to allow those different behaviours. Okay. So the IFM overall seems to be elastin and proteoglycan rich. We've seen it's really cellular. And this perhaps fits in a little bit with what Michael was talking about on turnover and some of the differences in the tissue. Rather interestingly, we seem to see a lot of turnover, specifically in the intervesicular matrix. We've done it in a couple of different ways. These are the beautiful pictures you get when you do proteomics, so you look at the proteome and what's in the sample. We see lots of neopeptides, specifically collagen ones in the IFM, which is suggesting you've got breakdown and the making of new collagen in the intervesicular matrix. These are stains that are looking at the making collagen or breakdown of collagen within tendon. Nothing happens within the fascicles. Just as you're saying, nothing happens. Half-life is endlessly long. But intervesicular matrix, we're seeing a lot of turnover. And certainly, as Michael was alluding to earlier, we're starting to wonder if this is the active region of tendon. This is the region where you start to see all the turnover, the changes. It's the region you need to keep healthy if you want to allow this tendon to function effectively. Okay. So that's kind of all the data I wanted to show, just to bring it into this conference slightly and to say kind of why I'm here as well and why this is particularly interesting for me. Of course, lots of that's in the horse model, and thinking about mechanics within the horse model and how it was responding. And I met Laura a few years ago at a conference who came very excitedly and came to talk to me about, I'll show you her data first, here we go, and talked to me about this data which she had done for her PhD with Dr. Tendon, looking at the Achilles tendon and looking at the sort of strains through the thickness of the Achilles tendon. And finding here, I thought it was fabulous, these differences. If you look within the different regions of the tendon, you see different amounts of movement, shearing planes in a tendon in vivo with somebody moving. And of course this was even more exciting for me. She found that as you get older, this ability for one part of the tendon to slide relative to the other started to reduce. So, okay. So what I'm really hoping at this stage to do is go back a slide and say, can we start to bring some of this together? And a lot of my interest here is to start to work on this and say, can we start to look in the human tendon? So we're starting work at the moment with anterior tibialis, posterior tibialis and the Achilles tendon, starting to look at this properties, as we were hearing, between the bundles of the tendon. Can we look at that ability for sliding between the different bundles of the tissue to understand response at this structural level in particular? So hopefully that's where we're heading, and I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about it and about some of the ultrasound work that's going on here, because it will fit in very nicely. And along those lines, anyone who is looking for a postdoc or knows anyone who's looking for a postdoc, we've actually just been awarded some funds with Laura and some other group in the UK to start to look at ultrasound imaging in tendons, to try and look at some of these shear planes in more detail. So we're on the lookout for somebody super interested in this field who wants to come to London for a couple of years. Alright, so on that note, I must thank all my lab members, particularly Siobhan, who did a lot of the work in the equine model, and thank you all very much.